William sat in his study, staring at the old leather journal he had found hidden in his father's desk drawer. The room felt smaller than usual, the weight of what he had just read pressing down on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. Outside, the autumn rain tapped against the windows of the family estate, matching the rhythm of his racing heart. He had been looking for his father's old business papers when he stumbled upon the journal, tucked away behind a false panel he never knew existed. His father had passed away 3 months ago, and William was still sorting through his belongings, trying to understand the man who had raised him. What he found in those yellowed pages changed everything he thought he knew about his family. The journal contained detailed entries spanning over 20 years, documenting a secret that his father had carried to his grave. Camilla, the woman William had known as his stepmother for the past 15 years, was not who she claimed to be. According to his father's careful notes, she had deliberately entered their lives with a plan that went far beyond simply finding love. William's hands trembled as he reread the entry from 22 years ago. His father had written about meeting a young woman named Camilla at a charity event. She had approached him with what seemed like genuine interest, but his father had grown suspicious over time. He hired a private investigator and discovered that Camilla had been researching their family for months before that first meeting. The investigation revealed that Camilla's real name was Caroline Miller, and she came from a family that had lost everything in a business deal with William's grandfather decades earlier. Her grandfather had been his grandfather's business partner until a bitter falling out left the Miller family in financial ruin. The Millers had always blamed William's family for their downfall, claiming they had been cheated out of their rightful share of the family fortune. William felt sick as he read about how Camilla had changed her identity, created a new background, and carefully positioned herself to meet his father. She had played the part of the perfect woman, understanding his interests, sharing his values, and slowly winning his trust. His father had written about the internal struggle he faced, torn between the love he felt for this woman and the knowledge that their entire relationship was built on deception. The most painful part was reading about his father's decision to stay silent. He had written page after page about his reasons, explaining how he had fallen too deeply in love to confront her about the truth. He convinced himself that perhaps her feelings had become genuine over time, that maybe the woman she pretended to be had become who she really was. He chose to protect the family from the scandal and pain that the truth would bring. William closed the journal and walked to the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. He thought about all the years Camilla had been part of their family. She had been there when his mother died, offering comfort and support during the darkest period of his life. She had helped him through college, celebrated his achievements, and been a constant presence at family gatherings. But now he questioned every memory, every moment of kindness, every gesture of love. Had it all been an elaborate performance? Had she been playing a role for over 2 decades, waiting for the right moment to strike? The woman who had read him bedtime stories, who had attended his graduation, who had held his hand at his father's funeral, was any of it real? The journal also contained financial records that made William's blood run cold. His father had documented several instances where large sums of money had gone missing from family accounts. The amounts were never huge enough to raise immediate suspicion, but, over the years, they added up to a substantial fortune. His father suspected Camilla was behind these disappearances but could never prove it definitively. William thought about his father's behavior in his final years. The man had become increasingly distant and worried, often staring off into space during family dinners. He had started asking strange questions about family loyalty and trust, conversations that had puzzled William at the time but now made perfect sense. His father had been carrying this burden alone, wrestling with the knowledge that the woman he loved might be slowly destroying everything his family had built. The phone rang, startling William from his thoughts. It was Camilla, calling to check on him as she did every evening since his father's death. Her voice was warm and caring, filled with the same maternal concern she had shown him for years. As she spoke about her day and asked about his plans for tomorrow, William found himself analyzing every word, searching for signs of deception he had missed before. "You sound tired, dear," she said, her voice gentle. Are you taking care of yourself? Your father would want you to rest properly. The mention of his father made William's stomach turn. How could she speak about him so lovingly when she had spent years lying to him? How could she continue this charade even after his death? After hanging up, William sat back in his father's chair and tried to think clearly about what he should do next. Part of him wanted to confront Camilla immediately, to throw the journal at her feet and demand explanations. But another part urged caution. His father had been a careful, methodical man, and there might be more to discover. William decided to follow his father's example and conduct his own investigation. He spent the rest of the evening going through the journal again, taking notes and creating a timeline of events. His father had been meticulous in his record-keeping, noting dates, amounts, and suspicious behaviors. There were names of people his father had contacted, leads he had followed, and evidence he had gathered. The next morning, William called his father's lawyer, Mr. Henderson, and arranged a meeting. He had known Henderson since childhood, and the man had always been a trusted family advisor. If anyone could help him navigate this situation, it would be him. Henderson's office was exactly as William remembered it, dark wood paneling, leather-bound books, and the faint smell of old paper and coffee. The elderly lawyer greeted him with the same paternal warmth he had shown when William was a boy, but his expression grew serious as William explained why he had come. "I wondered when you would find that journal," Henderson said quietly after William finished his story. "Your father came to see me about this matter several times over the years. He was torn apart by what he had discovered." William leaned forward in his chair. "You knew about this? You knew what she was doing?" Henderson nodded slowly. "Your father shared his suspicions with me, yes. He asked for my advice on how to handle the situation. I recommended he confront her directly, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. He loved her too much, and he was terrified of losing her. But she was stealing from us," William said, his voice rising. "She lied about everything. How could he let her get away with it?" "Your father was a complicated man," Henderson replied. "He had spent most of his life alone after your mother's death. Camilla brought him happiness he thought he would never feel again. He convinced himself that even if her original motives were wrong, her feelings had become genuine over time." William felt angry at his father for his weakness, but he also understood the impossible position the man had been in. Love could make people do irrational things, could blind them to truths that were obvious to others. His father had chosen love over justice, hope over evidence. Henderson opened a file cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. "Your father left specific instructions about what should happen if you discovered the truth about Camilla. He prepared this for you." Inside the folder were copies of everything from the journal, plus additional evidence William hadn't seen before. There were photographs of Camilla meeting with people his father couldn't identify, bank records showing the missing money, and a complete dossier on the Miller family's history with their family. Most shocking of all was a letter his father had written to him, sealed and marked to be opened only if the truth about Camilla came to light. With shaking hands, William broke the seal and began to read his father's final message to him. The letter was heartbreaking in its honesty. His father apologized for his weakness, for choosing to live with the lie rather than facing the painful truth. He explained that he had tried many times to end the relationship but found himself unable to live without Camilla, even knowing who she really was. He begged William's forgiveness and asked him to handle the situation with more courage than he had shown. But the letter also contained a warning. His father had reason to believe that Camilla's plan was not yet complete, that she was waiting for his death to make her final move against the family. He suspected she had been gathering information and evidence for years, possibly planning some kind of legal action that would give her claim to a significant portion of the family wealth. William felt overwhelmed by the enormity of what he faced. This was not just about confronting someone who had lied to his family. This was about protecting everything his ancestors had built from someone who was apparently planning to destroy it. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders, and he understood why his father had struggled with this burden for so long. Henderson watched him process the information, his weathered face filled with sympathy. "Your father was hoping this day would never come," he said softly. "But, he wanted to make sure you were prepared if it did. What are you planning to do?" William looked out the window at the busy street below, watching people go about their normal lives while his world fell apart. He thought about Camilla, probably at home right now, continuing her performance of grief for his father while planning her next move. The thought made him feel sick, but it also made him angry. "I need to know everything," William said finally. "I need to understand exactly what she's been doing and what she's planning to do. My father may have been too kind to stop her, but I won't make the same mistake." Henderson nodded approvingly. "Your father would be proud of you for taking a stand. But, you need to be careful. If she realizes you know the truth, she might accelerate whatever plans she has. We need to be smart about this." They spent the rest of the afternoon going through every piece of evidence, creating a strategy for investigating Camilla without alerting her to their suspicions. Henderson recommended a private investigator who could dig deeper into her current activities, and they discussed the legal options available if they could prove she had stolen money or committed fraud. As William left Henderson's office, he felt a strange mixture of determination and sadness. He was ready to fight for his family's legacy, but he mourned the loss of the woman he had thought Camilla was. Whether she had ever truly cared for him or his father, he might never know, but he could not allow her deception to continue. That evening, Camilla called again with her usual concern and warmth. This time, William was ready for her. He listened carefully to every word, noting anything that might give him insight into her true thoughts and plans. She mentioned having lunch with some old friends he had never heard of before, and talked about some legal documents she was organizing. These details, which would have seemed innocent before, now took on sinister significance. "I've been thinking about your father's wishes for the estate," she said near the end of their conversation. "Perhaps we should meet tomorrow to discuss some things. There are matters he wanted me to handle that we should address soon." William's heart raced. Was this the beginning of whatever she had been planning? Was she about to make her move now that his father was gone and she thought William was still unaware of her true identity? "Of course," William replied, keeping his voice steady. "Why don't you come by the estate tomorrow afternoon? We can go through everything together." After hanging up, William called Henderson to report the conversation and prepare for what might be the beginning of the end of Camilla's long deception. Whatever she was planning, he would be ready for her. His father's weakness had allowed this situation to continue for too long, but William was determined to protect his family's legacy and honor his father's final request for justice. The rain had stopped, and moonlight streamed through the study windows as William sat with his father's journal one more time. Tomorrow would bring answers, but tonight he grieved for the father who had carried this burden alone and the stepmother who might never have existed at all. William barely slept that night, his mind racing with possibilities of what Camilla might reveal during their meeting. He had set up a hidden recording device in his father's study, following Henderson's advice to document everything. The morning crawled by as he waited for afternoon to arrive, every tick of the clock echoing in the silent house. At precisely 2 o'clock, Camilla's car pulled into the circular driveway. William watched from the window as she stepped out, carrying a leather briefcase he had never seen before. She looked exactly as she always did, elegant, composed, with the gentle smile that had comforted him through countless difficult moments. It was hard to believe that this woman, who looked so familiar and safe, might be his family's greatest threat. "William, darling," she said warmly as he opened the door, reaching up to kiss his cheek. "You look tired. Are you sleeping enough?" Even knowing what he knew, William found himself responding to her maternal concern. This was the woman who had nursed him through childhood illnesses, who had celebrated his achievements and comforted his disappointments. The thought that it might all have been calculated made him feel physically ill. They settled in the study where he had discovered the journal just 2 days earlier. Camilla placed her briefcase on the desk and looked around the room with what appeared to be genuine nostalgia. "Your father spent so many hours in this room," she said softly. "I can still feel his presence here. He was such a thoughtful man, always planning ahead, always trying to protect the people he loved." William's jaw tightened. If she only knew how much planning his father had actually done, how many sleepless nights he had spent in this very room, writing in his journal about the woman sitting across from him. "You mentioned some documents he wanted you to handle," William said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "What did he have in mind?" Camilla's expression shifted slightly, becoming more serious and businesslike. She opened her briefcase and pulled out several folders, arranging them carefully on the desk. "Your father was very concerned about the family legacy," she began. "He spent his final months organizing things to make sure everything would be handled properly after his death. He asked me to present these documents to you when I felt you were ready to hear about them." She handed him the first folder, and William's hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside were what appeared to be legal documents, but they weren't anything he recognized from the estate planning he had been involved in with Henderson. "These are papers documenting some historical injustices involving your family," Camilla said, her voice taking on a tone he had never heard before. It was still gentle, but there was an undertone of steel that made him look up sharply. "Your father discovered some troubling information about how your grandfather built his fortune." William felt his blood turn to ice as he realized what was happening. This was it, the moment his father had warned him about in the letter. Camilla was making her move, but she was doing it in a way that made it seem like his father had authorized it. "I don't understand," William said carefully. "What kind of injustices?" Camilla pulled out a thick file from her briefcase, and William could see it contained old photographs, newspaper clippings, and what looked like business documents from decades past. "Your grandfather destroyed my family," she said simply, and, for the first time since he had known her, William heard her speak with complete honesty. The mask was finally coming off. William stared at her, trying to process what he was hearing. She had just admitted to being connected to his family's past in a way that confirmed everything his father had discovered. "Your family," he repeated slowly. Camilla nodded, and he could see tears beginning to form in her eyes. But, whether they were tears of sadness, anger, or relief at finally telling the truth, he couldn't tell. "My grandfather was Thomas Miller," she said. "He was your grandfather's business partner and closest friend for over 20 years. They built their first company together, shared their dreams and their struggles. And then, your grandfather betrayed him and destroyed everything." She opened the file and showed him a photograph of two young men standing in front of a small factory. One of them was clearly his grandfather. William could see the family resemblance immediately. The other must be Thomas Miller, Camilla's grandfather. They were like brothers, Camilla continued. They had an agreement that they would always be equal partners, no matter how big the business grew. But, when they struck it rich with a government contract during the war, your grandfather changed. He found a way to push my grandfather out of the business, claiming he hadn't contributed equally to the new venture. William looked at the documents she spread across the desk. There were contracts, legal papers, and correspondence between the two men. He could see his grandfather's signature on papers that seemed to formalize the dissolution of the partnership, but he couldn't understand the legal language well enough to know what they really meant. "My grandfather lost everything," Camilla said, her voice growing harder. "His share of the business, his reputation, his savings, everything he had worked for his entire life. He tried to fight it in court, but your family had more money and better lawyers. He died a broken man, convinced that his closest friend had deliberately ruined him." William felt confused and overwhelmed. This story was different from what he had expected. In his father's journal, Camilla had seemed like a cold, calculating villain who had targeted their family for revenge. But, sitting here listening to her, he could hear genuine pain in her voice, real emotion behind her words. "Even if that's true," William said slowly, "that was almost 60 years ago. Why are you telling me this now? Camilla wiped her eyes and straightened in her chair. The vulnerable moment had passed, and he could see her composing herself back into the woman he recognized. Because your father asked me to, she said firmly. He spent years researching what really happened between our grandfathers. He found evidence that your grandfather had indeed cheated mine, and he wanted to make it right. She pulled out another set of documents from her briefcase. These looked more recent, and William could see his father's handwriting on several of them. Your father was planning to transfer a significant portion of the family wealth to me as compensation for what your grandfather had stolen, Camilla explained. He felt it was the only way to balance the scales and clear the family name of the dishonor your grandfather had brought to it. William stared at the papers, his mind reeling. Could this be true? Had his father actually been planning to give away the family fortune? The documents looked genuine, and the handwriting was definitely his father's, but something about the situation felt wrong. If my father wanted to do this, why didn't he tell me about it while he was alive? William asked. He was afraid you wouldn't understand, Camilla replied. He knew how much pride you take in the family legacy, and he was worried you would try to talk him out of doing the right thing. He planned to explain everything to you after the transfer was complete. William felt a surge of anger. Whether this was true or not, he resented the implication that his father thought he was too immature or selfish to understand the need for justice. How much money are we talking about? He asked bluntly. 40% of the total estate, Camilla said without hesitation. Your father calculated that this represented the value of what my grandfather should have inherited if the partnership had been honored. William's vision blurred for a moment. 40% of the estate was an enormous sum, enough to leave him comfortable but nowhere near the wealth his family had always enjoyed. If this was legitimate, it would fundamentally change his entire future. I need to see proof that my father actually wanted this, William said firmly. These documents could have been forged. I need to verify this with Henderson and the other estate lawyers. Camilla's expression didn't change, but William thought he detected a flicker of something, annoyance. Worry? In her eyes. Of course, she said smoothly. Your father anticipated that you would want verification. That's why he left this with Henderson to be given to you only after I had explained the situation. She handed him a sealed envelope with his name written on it in his father's handwriting. William's heart sank as he recognized the script. It looked identical to the letter he had found with Henderson, but he knew this couldn't be authentic. Before I open this, William said carefully, I want you to tell me the truth about something. What is your real name? For the first time since she had begun her story, Camilla looked genuinely surprised. She stared at him for a long moment, and he could see her mind working, trying to figure out how much he knew. My real name is Caroline Miller, she said finally. I changed it to Camilla when I was 25, after my grandmother died. She had always called me Camilla as a nickname, and I liked it better than Caroline. It was a partial truth, William realized. She was admitting to the name change but not to the reason behind it or the elaborate deception that had followed. Why did you really approach my father 20 years ago? He pressed. Camilla was quiet for a long moment, and William could see her weighing her options. Finally, she sighed deeply. Because I wanted to understand the man whose grandfather had destroyed my family, she said. I was angry and hurt, and I wanted to see what kind of people you all were. I thought perhaps you were all as cruel and selfish as your grandfather had been. And, what did you discover? That your father was a good man, she said, and, for the first time since she had started talking, her voice sounded completely genuine. That he was kind and generous and nothing like the monster I had imagined. I fell in love with him, William. That wasn't part of any plan, it just happened. William felt his anger wavering. There was something in her voice, in the way she looked at him, that suggested she was finally telling him the complete truth. But he couldn't forget what his father had written in his journal, the evidence of missing money and years of deception. If you loved him, why did you steal from him? William asked quietly. Camilla's face went white, and he knew he had caught her off guard. She hadn't expected him to know about the missing money. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. William stood up and walked to his father's desk, pulling out the journal he had hidden there before her arrival. My father documented everything, he said, showing her the familiar leather cover. He knew exactly who you were from the beginning, and he knew about the money you took over the years. Camilla stared at the journal as if it were a poisonous snake. All the color had drained from her face, and her carefully composed demeanor was cracking. He knew, she whispered. He knew everything, William confirmed. He knew your real name, he knew about your grandfather, and he knew you had been lying to him for 20 years. The question is, what am I supposed to do about it now? Camilla slumped back in her chair, and, suddenly, she looked older and more fragile than William had ever seen her. The strong, confident woman who had raised him was gone, replaced by someone who looked lost and defeated. He never said anything, she murmured. All these years, he never let on that he knew. Because he loved you, William said, and he was surprised to hear the sadness in his own voice. He chose to live with the lie because he couldn't bear to lose you. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 20 years of deception hanging between them. William looked at this woman who had been such an important part of his life, trying to reconcile the caring stepmother he remembered with the person who had systematically stolen from his father while lying about her identity. What happens now? Camilla asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. William looked at the document spread across the desk, at the journal that contained his father's tortured thoughts, at the woman whose true story he was only beginning to understand. He thought about the choices his father had made and the choice he now faced himself. Now we figure out the truth about everything, he said. About your grandfather and mine, about the money that's missing, and about what my father really wanted to happen after he died. And, then, we decide how to move forward. Camilla nodded slowly, and William could see that some part of her was relieved that the pretense was finally over. But, he also knew that this conversation was just the beginning. There were still too many questions unanswered, too many versions of the truth to sort through. The real work of understanding what had happened to both their families was just beginning. The following week was the most difficult of William's life. After Camilla's partial confession, he had asked her to stay away from the estate while he sorted through everything she had told him. She had agreed, but not before making one final plea for him to understand that whatever she had done wrong, her love for both him and his father had been genuine. William spent his days working with Henderson and a team of investigators to verify every claim Camilla had made. They examined the documents she had brought, cross-referenced them with historical records, and tried to piece together the true story of what had happened between their grandfathers 60 years earlier. What they discovered was more complicated than either William or his father had imagined. The business partnership between his grandfather and Thomas Miller had indeed ended badly, but the truth was murkier than either family's version of events suggested. Your grandfather wasn't entirely innocent, Henderson told him as they reviewed the findings in his office. But he wasn't the villain that Camilla's family made him out to be either. The historical evidence showed that both men had made mistakes during their business relationship. William's grandfather had indeed maneuvered to gain a larger share of their most profitable venture, but Thomas Miller had also been secretly negotiating deals behind his partner's back. When their relationship deteriorated, both men had tried to protect their own interests, leading to a bitter legal battle that destroyed their friendship and severely damaged both families financially. The tragedy is that they were both good men who let business and pride ruin a lifelong friendship, Henderson continued. Neither family deserved what happened, but neither family was entirely blameless either. William felt a strange sense of relief at this news. It meant that his family's wealth hadn't been built on deliberate cruelty, but it also meant that Camilla's anger and pain were based on something real. Her grandfather had suffered genuine losses, even if they weren't entirely his grandfather's fault. The investigation into the missing money from his father's accounts was more straightforward but equally troubling. Over the years, Camilla had indeed transferred significant amounts to various accounts, but the pattern was more complex than simple theft. She was sending money to other members of the Miller family, the private investigator explained to William. Elderly relatives who were struggling financially, cousins who needed medical care, descendants of Thomas Miller who never recovered from the original business failure. William stared at the bank records spread across Henderson's conference table. The amounts were substantial, but they had been going to pay for nursing home care, medical bills, and basic living expenses for people who were genuinely in need. So she was stealing from my father to support her real family? William asked. It appears that way, Henderson confirmed. Though the legal situation is complicated. She had access to the accounts through the power of attorney your father gave her, so technically she wasn't stealing in the traditional sense. But, she was certainly misusing that trust. William felt exhausted by the complexity of it all. Nothing was as simple as he had hoped it would be. Camilla wasn't a straightforward villain, but she also wasn't innocent. His grandfather wasn't a saint, but he also wasn't a monster. Even his father's response to the situation had been neither purely wise nor purely foolish. The most difficult part was trying to understand what his father had really wanted to happen after his death. The documents Camilla had shown him were forgeries, as William had suspected, but they were based on real conversations she had had with his father about their family's history. Your father did feel guilty about what had happened between the grandfathers, Henderson told him. He had several conversations with me about whether he should try to help Camilla's family financially. But, he never made any concrete plans to transfer 40% of the estate. What did he plan to do? William asked. He was considering setting up a charitable foundation that would provide assistance to descendants of families who had been harmed by early industrial business practices, Henderson explained. It would have helped the Miller family along with many others, but it wouldn't have been a direct transfer of wealth. William realized that Camilla had taken his father's feelings of guilt and genuine concern for her family and twisted them into something that served her purposes. She had created documents that made it seem like his father supported her claim for massive compensation, when in reality he had been considering a much more modest and fair response to their family's complicated history. That evening, William called Camilla and asked her to meet him at a neutral location, a small cafe near the university where they could talk privately without the emotional weight of being in his father's house. She arrived looking anxious and tired. The confident woman who had raised him was gone, replaced by someone who looked like she hadn't slept in days. William felt a pang of sympathy for her, despite everything she had done. I know the documents you showed me were fake, William said without preamble. He had decided that directness was the only way to handle this situation. My father never authorized transferring 40% of the estate to you. Camilla's shoulders sagged, and she nodded slowly. I know you would find out eventually, she said. I was hoping you would understand why I did it before you discovered the truth. Help me understand, William said. Explain to me why you thought it was acceptable to forge my father's signature and try to steal millions of dollars from my family. Camilla was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup as if it might contain answers to questions she had been wrestling with for decades. Because I was tired of watching my family suffer while your family lived in comfort built on their pain, she said finally. Because every time I sat in your father's beautiful house, I thought about my grandmother dying in a state-run nursing home because we couldn't afford better care. Because every time I saw you worry about which college to attend, I thought about my cousins who never had the chance to go to college at all. William could hear the real anguish in her voice, and he began to understand the internal struggle she had been facing for years. She had genuinely loved his father and him, but she had also been watching her real family struggle while living in the midst of wealth that she believed rightfully belonged to them. But, you could have talked to my father about helping your family, William pointed out. You said yourself that he felt guilty about what had happened. If you had been honest with him, he might have found a way to help. I tried, Camilla said, and, for the first time, tears began to run down her cheeks. Not directly, but I tried to bring up the subject of corporate responsibility and historical injustices. But every time I started to approach the topic, I could see him becoming suspicious and worried. I was terrified that if I pushed too hard, he would investigate and discover who I really was. So you decided to take matters into your own hands. I started by just taking small amounts, she admitted. Money that I didn't think would be missed, just enough to help with my grandmother's medical bills. But, then, other family members started having crises, and the amounts got larger. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that I would find a way to pay it back or that I would eventually tell your father the truth. William could see how the deception had grown over time, each small compromise leading to larger ones until she was trapped in a web of lies that seemed impossible to escape from. What about the forged documents? When did you decide to try to claim 40% of the estate? Camilla wiped her eyes and looked at him directly for the first time since they had sat down. After your father died, she said. I panicked. I knew that without him there to protect me, you would eventually discover the missing money and figure out who I really was. I thought if I could make it seem like he had authorized a large transfer, it would cover the money I had taken and provide enough for my family to be secure forever. So you created fake documents and tried to convince me that my father had planned to give away the family fortune. Yes, she whispered. It was wrong, and I knew it was wrong even as I was doing it. But I was desperate, and I couldn't see any other way to protect the people I cared about. William leaned back in his chair, processing everything she had told him. He could understand her motivations, even if he couldn't excuse her actions. She had been caught between two families, two loyalties, and two different versions of right and wrong. What happens to us now? Camilla asked. Are you going to have me arrested? Are you going to press charges for the money I took? William had been wrestling with this question for days. Legally, he probably had grounds to pursue criminal charges against her. The forged documents alone were a serious crime, and the misuse of his father's power of attorney could be prosecuted as a form of fraud. But, he also knew that his father had chosen not to pursue legal action during his lifetime, despite knowing about her deception for years. His father had made that choice out of love, but also out of an understanding that the situation was more complicated than simple right and wrong. I don't want to destroy you, William said carefully. But I also can't pretend that what you did was acceptable. There have to be consequences. Camilla nodded, and he could see that she had been expecting this. I want you to return every penny you took from my father's accounts, William continued. I know most of it went to help your family, but you need to find a way to pay it back. And I want a full accounting of where every dollar went and why. I can do that, Camilla said quickly. It will take me some time to gather all the records, but I can show you exactly how the money was used. Second, I want you to tell me everything about your family's current financial situation. If there are people who genuinely need help, we can discuss ways to provide assistance that don't involve theft and deception. Camilla looked surprised. You would consider helping my family? My father felt there was a moral obligation to address the injustices of the past, William said. I don't agree with your methods, but that doesn't mean I disagree with your goals. If we can find a fair and honest way to provide assistance, then that's what we should do. And what about us? Camilla asked quietly. What about our relationship? I know I've lost the right to call you my son, but I hope someday you might be able to forgive me. This was the question William had been dreading most. For 20 years, this woman had been the closest thing he had to a mother. She had shaped who he was, supported him through difficult times, and been a constant source of love and guidance. Learning that it had all been built on lies felt like losing his father all over again. But, sitting here listening to her explain her choices, seeing the genuine remorse and pain in her eyes, he realized that the love had been real, even if the circumstances weren't. She had lied about her identity and stolen money, but she had also been there for him when he needed her most. "I don't know if I can forgive you," William said honestly. "At least not yet. But, I don't want to lose you completely either. Maybe we can find a way to build something new, something based on honesty this time." Camilla nodded through her tears, and William could see both relief and hope in her expression. "There's one more thing," William added. "I want to know about the real Caroline Miller. Not the character you created to marry my father, but the actual person you were before you decided to change your identity. If we're going to start over, I need to know who you really are." Camilla smiled through her tears, and, for the first time since this whole situation began, William saw something in her face that looked completely genuine and unguarded. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like to finally be myself with you." As they left the cafe, William felt a mixture of sadness, relief, and cautious hope. The easy relationship they had once shared was gone forever, destroyed by years of deception and the weight of their family's complicated history. But perhaps they could build something new in its place, something more honest and, ultimately more meaningful than what they had lost. 3 months later, William sat in his father's study, now transformed into something that felt more like his own space. The heavy curtains had been replaced with lighter ones that let in more sunlight, and he had added some modern furniture alongside the traditional pieces his father had preferred. The room felt different now, less like a shrine to the past and more like a place where the future could be planned. On his desk were 2 folders. One contained the final report from the investigation into Caroline's, financial activities over the past 20 years. The other held the proposal for the Thomas Miller Foundation, the charitable organization William had decided to establish in honor of both his grandfather and Caroline's grandfather. The past few months had been a journey of discovery that neither William nor Caroline could have anticipated when they first sat in this room and confronted the truth about their relationship. Working together to uncover their family's real history had been painful, but it had also been healing in ways neither of them had expected. Caroline had been true to her word about providing a complete accounting of the money she had taken. The final tally was substantial, nearly $800,000 over 15 years, but the detailed record she provided showed exactly where every penny had gone. Medical bills for elderly relatives, education funds for younger family members, mortgage payments to prevent foreclosures, and emergency assistance during family crises. She wasn't living luxuriously on the money, Henderson had observed when they reviewed the final report. She was essentially running an unauthorized family welfare program. William had been amazed by the thoroughness of Caroline's record-keeping. She had documented every transaction, kept receipts for every expense, and even tracked the outcomes of her assistance. A cousin who had been able to finish nursing school with her help was now supporting her own family. An uncle whose farm had been saved from foreclosure was now profitable again. Her grandmother had lived her final years in comfort instead of struggling with inadequate care. The investigation had also revealed the true extent of the ongoing impact of the original business dispute between their grandfathers. The Miller family had never recovered from the loss of Thomas Miller's share of the partnership, and subsequent generations had struggled with poverty, limited education opportunities, and the accumulated disadvantages that came from having no family wealth to draw upon. It's remarkable that Caroline managed to achieve what she did in life, given where she started, William told Henderson as they reviewed her background report. She put herself through college working multiple jobs, earned advanced degrees, and built a successful career in nonprofit management before she ever met my father. This discovery had shifted William's understanding of Caroline's deception. She hadn't been a con artist looking for an easy mark. She had been an accomplished, intelligent woman who had also happened to be carrying the weight of her family's historical grievances. Her decision to approach his father had been motivated by complex emotions, curiosity, anger, a desire for justice, and, perhaps hope that she could find a way to right old wrongs. Working together to research their grandfather's business relationship had brought William and Caroline closer than they had ever been before. For the first time, she was sharing her real thoughts, her actual memories of growing up hearing stories about the Miller family's lost fortune, and her genuine feelings about the choices she had made. I think the hardest part was watching your father struggle with guilt about something that wasn't really his fault, Caroline told him one afternoon as they went through old newspaper articles about the original business dispute. He was such a good man, and he was torturing himself over actions taken by someone else decades before he was even born. Did you ever think about telling him the truth? William asked. Every day, Caroline replied. Especially after I fell in love with him. But, by then, I was trapped. How do you tell someone you love that your entire relationship is based on a lie? How do you explain that you've been living under a false identity for years? William could see the genuine anguish in her face as she spoke about this internal conflict. He was beginning to understand that she had been as much a victim of her own deception as anyone else. The process of establishing the Thomas Miller Foundation had given them both a constructive way to channel their energy and emotion about their family's history. Instead of focusing on blame and recrimination, they were working together to create something positive that would honor both their grandfather's memories while helping families who had faced similar historical injustices. The foundation will provide assistance to families who can demonstrate that they were harmed by unethical business practices in the industrial era, William explained to the board of directors he had assembled. We're not trying to relitigate old legal cases, but we are trying to provide practical help to people whose families never recovered from historical economic damages. Caroline had volunteered to serve as the foundation's executive director, and her background in nonprofit management made her uniquely qualified for the role. Working together on the foundation had allowed them to rebuild their relationship on entirely new terms, based on shared goals rather than the family dynamics that had defined their past interactions. It feels strange to call you William instead of calling you my son, Caroline said one day as they worked together in the foundation's new offices. But, in some ways, I feel like I know you better now than I ever did before. I feel the same way, William admitted. When you were my stepmother, there was always a certain distance, a role you were playing. Now I feel like I'm getting to know the real person. The real Caroline Miller was different from the woman who had raised him, but she was also more interesting and complex. She had a sharp sense of humor that she had kept hidden for years, strong opinions about social justice issues that went far beyond her family's specific grievances, and a level of professional competence that impressed everyone who worked with her. She was also more emotionally available than the woman William remembered from his childhood. The effort of maintaining her false identity for so many years had required her to keep parts of herself hidden, including her capacity for deep friendship and her natural leadership abilities. I think I spent so much energy being who I thought your father wanted me to be that I forgot who I actually was, Caroline told him one evening as they closed up the foundation offices. It's liberating to finally be myself, even if it came at such a high cost. The financial resolution of their situation had been complex but, ultimately fair. Caroline had liquidated her savings and sold her house to repay the money she had taken from William's father's accounts. William had then donated that money to the foundation as its initial endowment, effectively ensuring that the funds would be used to help families in need rather than simply returning to his personal wealth. It's poetic justice, Henderson had observed. The money that was taken to help the Miller family will now be used to help many families facing similar situations. William had also used the opportunity to restructure his inheritance in a way that felt more aligned with his values. Instead of simply maintaining the family fortune for his own benefit, he had committed to donating a significant portion to charitable causes, including the Thomas Miller Foundation. The personal healing between William and Caroline had been gradual and, sometimes difficult. There were days when William felt angry about the years of deception, and there were days when Caroline struggled with shame about the choices she had made. But, they had both committed to working through these feelings honestly rather than pretending they didn't exist. I keep thinking about your father, and what he would think about how this all turned out, Caroline said as they sat in his study on the anniversary of his father's death. I think he would be proud of the foundation and the way we found to honor both our families' memories. William looked around the room where he had first discovered his father's journal, remembering the anger and confusion he had felt that night. It seemed like a lifetime ago, though it had only been 6 months. I think he would be relieved, William said. He carried the burden of this secret alone for so many years. At least now everything is out in the open, and we're dealing with it together. They had established new traditions and routines that reflected their changed relationship. Caroline no longer called him every evening as she had when she was playing the role of his stepmother, but they had lunch together once a week to discuss foundation business and maintain their personal connection. William had also begun dating someone new, a woman he had met through his volunteer work with other charitable organizations. Caroline had met her and given her approval, something that felt both natural and strange given their complicated history. "It's funny," Caroline told him after meeting his girlfriend for the first time. "I feel like I have more right to an opinion about your personal life now than I did when I was technically your stepmother. Then, I was just playing a role, but now I actually care about you as a person rather than as my husband's son." The Thomas Miller Foundation had begun its work in earnest, providing assistance to dozens of families who had suffered from historical business injustices. They had helped descendants of workers who had been cheated out of pensions, families whose land had been taken through fraudulent real estate deals, and immigrants who had been exploited by unethical labor practices. Each case they handled taught them more about the long-term consequences of economic injustice and the ways that historical wrongs could echo through generations. It had given both William and Caroline a sense of purpose that went far beyond their personal family drama. "I understand now why your father was attracted to this kind of work," Caroline told him as they reviewed applications from families seeking assistance. "There's something deeply satisfying about being able to right old wrongs, even if you can't fix everything." On the first anniversary of his father's death, William and Caroline visited his grave together. It was the first time they had been there together since the funeral, and both of them felt the weight of how much had changed since then. "I think he knew this was how it would end," William said as they stood by the headstone. "Not the specific details, but the general outcome. He knew that eventually the truth would come out, and he trusted us to handle it better than he had been able to. He was a good man who found himself in an impossible situation," Caroline said. "I regret that I put him in that position, but I'm grateful for the way he handled it. A lesser man would have thrown me out of his life the moment he discovered the truth." As they walked back to their cars, William reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this point. He had lost the stepmother he thought he knew, but he had gained a friend and partner in meaningful work. He had discovered painful truths about his family's history, but he had also found ways to address those truths constructively. The Thomas Miller Foundation had become more than just a way to resolve their personal family conflict. It had become a model for how historical injustices could be addressed through practical, forward-looking action rather than endless litigation or recrimination. "I've been thinking about expanding our scope," William told Caroline as they drove back from the cemetery. "There are a lot of families out there who were harmed by various kinds of historical injustices. Maybe we could develop programs to address some of the other forms of systematic economic harm that occurred in past generations." "I've been thinking the same thing," Caroline replied. "We've learned so much from our own family's situation about how these historical wounds can be healed. It would be a shame not to apply that knowledge more broadly." That evening, William sat in his study one last time with his father's journal. He had read it countless times over the past year, but tonight he was reading it differently. Instead of focusing on the pain and conflict it contained, he was looking for the wisdom and love that had motivated his father's careful documentation of their family crisis. His father had been a man caught between competing loyalties and difficult choices, but he had ultimately chosen love over judgment, hope over cynicism, and patience over hasty action. These were lessons that William was still learning to apply in his own life. He opened a new journal, his own this time, and began to write about the year that had just passed, documenting the lessons he had learned about family, forgiveness, and the complex nature of justice. Someday, he hoped, his own children would read these words and understand something about the choices he had made and the values that had guided him through his own impossible situation. Outside, the autumn rain was tapping against the windows again, just as it had been that night when he first discovered the truth about Caroline. But, this time, the sound was comforting rather than ominous. It reminded him that storms pass, seasons change, and that even the most difficult situations could eventually lead to new growth and understanding. As he wrote, William thought about the Foundation's work, about Caroline's transformation from deception to authenticity, about his father's legacy, and about the future they were all building together. It wasn't the future any of them had planned, but it was good and meaningful and true in ways that their previous arrangements had never been. The truth had been painful, but it had also been liberating. And, in the end, William realized, that was probably what his father had hoped for all along.